Hi, welcome to this video about cloud busting, a device containing several modes of operation with a clever patch bay to influence the behavior of the 6 available sound engines. The name of this eurorack module made by Error Instruments is a reference to a rather tragic story about an Austrian psychoanalyst called Wilhelm Reich, who constructed a device called a cloudbuster in the 1960s, which was claimed to be able to influence weather patterns, and more importantly, the device caused clouds to drop their water content by drawing a certain kind of energy called orgone energy out of the atmosphere, much like a lightning rod absorbs energy from the sky by grounding it to the earth. Wilhelm Reich was at some point abruptly arrested, and soon after he died in his holding cell. How exactly remains a mystery. Many thanks to Error Instruments for sending me this interesting device. There won't be any deep patches or sound examples in this video, apart from the demonstration of the different features of the module, as there's a lot of ground to cover to show at least some of the things that are possible. So let's get started right away. Let me quickly take you through the different modes of cloud busting. The first mode is actually achieved by patching nothing to the master output. In this mode, you have control over the pitch of the oscillator with the knobs, accompanied by these little buttons. So it's only when I press a button that tuning pot is active. As you can see, turning this one doesn't change anything until I press this button. The second mode is called sequencer. You get this by simply connecting it to the master output. Now these buttons and knobs have a completely different function. By the way, when I'm talking about the knobs, you can override them by sending in CV. Best to set the knobs in the center position or somewhere around the center when you're sending in CV, because when you turn them completely to the left or completely to the right, sending in a CV signal won't have any effect. You can send in bipolar signals, by the way. And just like with these knobs, it's mode dependent of what these CV inputs actually do, but they always influence the same function or parameter as the knob beneath it. So in sequencer mode, as you might have guessed, the knobs control the pitch of the 4 steps. The buttons have a different function. Holding the second button kind of forces the sequencer to repeat one single step. Pressing the last button randomizes the order of the steps, and pressing the first or the third one influences the global pitch of the sequence. Instead of just holding it down like I did just there, you can also press these momentarily and the pitch will change in small increments. You can change the speed and the behavior of this sequencer mode by connecting any of these top bolts to any of these bottom bolts, but I'll go into those after I've shown you every mode. So above the sequence mode, there's the drone mode. This is kind of an FM drone. and buttons just act like in the first mode when we didn't have anything connected, meaning that the knobs influence the pitch, but they only become active when you press the button above it. Then there's the plum mode. This mode is similar to what Indian Resonator is doing, and both of these engines are digital versions or interpretations of what the Seat Lombardo Plum is doing, but in a completely different way, of course. Turning these knobs changes the behavior of two oscillators that keep pressing each other away, causing the sound to resonate less or more. And really these knobs or these parameters are slightly dependent, meaning that turning this knob will change the sound in a different way when I set the first knob like this. So it's possible to get really deep sounding drones from this. And when you find the right sweet spot, you can get it to sound like a flute. And when you find these flute-like overtone sounds at really low frequencies, these can be really powerful bass sounds. In this mode, I haven't found any use for the buttons unless you start connecting other bolts, but like I said, I will go into that later. Now let's connect the chord mode. Now personally I think this is a really interesting mode because you can tune the voices separately. And I'll show you later there's different ways to get chords out of cloud busting. But with this dedicated chord mode you can do all kinds of interesting things using the buttons and the knobs, which I will all show you later in the video. Then there's the basic FM synth. For this mode, these buttons just go to a random setting. Not really random because they're always the same, but I think you know what I mean. My best guess for these knobs is that the fourth knob changes the pitch of the modulator, this being an FM mode. So there's got to be a carrier and a modulator. So this changes the pitch of one of those. I really think this one changes the amount of frequency modulation, meaning the FM index. Because when you turn this down, there's no FM at all. The second knob is just kind of a volume control. And the first one for me is the most interesting parameter. Let me turn down the FM. this knob scans through a really huge bank of waves. So it's kind of an FM wavetable mode. Again, sending in CV to this is really interesting. And there's some really cool sounds in there. Sometimes they're so close together it's hard to get just the one you want, but it's possible. Okay, let me scan further through the bank. Running this through a reverb is just amazing. Okay, now for the last mode. This is a special one, this is the random mode. This mode cycles through all the different sound engines cloud busting has to offer. And I found that the knobs and buttons always have the function of the mode that's happening to play. But you have to be really quick to actually try to control any of this, because as fast as you can turn the knob, the sound engine has already changed and you're just doing something else than you wanted to. But nevertheless, when you send in some random CV into this, you can even randomize the random function of cloud busting. Now let's have a look at the different modes, but on a deeper level, by connecting the different bolts at the top to the different bolts at the bottom. And by doing this, you can greatly expand the feature set of every mode. Right now we're listening to just the basic oscillator mode, which we achieve by not connecting anything to the master bolt. And I'm going to start off by connecting the lightning bolt, which is this one, to the different bolts at the top. In most modes, connecting the lightning bolt, which is considered an output, to any of the inputs causes the sound to be triggered. You can influence the speed by going up. So the next one is even slower. And connecting the lightning bolt to the chords creates the slowest tempo. Connecting the FM bolt is a little bit faster than the chords, but slower than the plum. So essentially, in every mode or in every connection where speed is a factor, connecting anything to the chord will always cause the slowest changes or the slowest sequence. and in most cases connecting anything to the random randomizes the length or the speed of the triggers. And even with this connected, the function of the knobs and the buttons is still the same as it was before. Now let's try what the cloud output does. Connecting the cloud to any of the top bolts acts similar to the triggers coming from the lightning bolt, but now instead of a trigger, it's more of an envelope with a slower decay. So again, going up slows everything down. This actually sounds a lot like my neighbor parking his car. And again, even with this envelope, connecting it to the randomizes the speed. Now let's have a look what the moon bolt does. Let's start off by connecting it to the first bolt here, which is the sequencer bolt. And as you can hear, just like I told you before, this is one of the ways to create chords. Even we're not in the chord mode. The knobs and the buttons still act the same as before. And it's interesting to know that when you disconnect, most of the times when you reconnect, there's a different chord or a different voicing. So connecting the moon to the sequencer bolt gives us a chord. Now what happens when I connect moon to the drone bolt? Let me try this in a different way. Let me just touch the bolts so you can better see what I'm doing. First, second. Plum adds even one voice more. The next one, most of the times, is a little bit dissonant. And the FM bolt is the most dissonant. And again, the randomizes between these different voicings or chords. Now I want to show you something else. So I think this is a nice chord. As you can see, the knobs and the buttons still act like before. Let's, for the first time, add some CV to one of those. So let me turn down the LFO. You might notice that the LED cable stops blinking, but that's just because I've turned the LFO so low, and I mean in amplitude, not in speed, that the LEDs in the cable don't light up anymore. Now before going to the thunderstorm bolt in this mode, I want to show you that you always can combine different things with each other. So I want to add a kind of rhythm or a tempo to this, and I want it to be slow. So you can just connect the cloud here to the chords. So you can combine these different things into creating a more interesting patch. Okay, more about these things later, because I still need to tackle the thunderstorm bolt here. Let's connect it to the sequencer bolt. And what this does is create kind of a different voicing. I'm not exactly sure what the voicings are. This one is only the root note, and it certainly is a square wave. As previously, or when I just disconnect this, I feel it's more like a saw wave. The plum is kind of a resonating or more high-pitched sound. Chords gives us yet another kind of voicing. FM is different again. And you can clearly hear the difference between all these voicings or sounds when I connect to random, which, as usual, randomizes the output between the different settings here. And the buttons and the knobs still act just like before. Now I can do what I did before, make a chord out of this. Maybe I don't want it to be random, but I want the high-pitched resonating tone more. So let's use the plum for that. And I want random triggers. So moving on to mode 1, which is the 4-step sequencer. We get this mode by just connecting the sequencer bolt to the master output. And as I explained before, the knobs set the pitch for every step. The buttons drop or increase the pitch, hold the sequencer, or randomizes it. Now let's start connecting the different bolts at the bottom to the different bolts at the top. Let's start off with the Thunderbolt to the left here. Previously this added a trigger pattern to our output. Let's see what it does in the 4-step sequencer. And it actually does kind of the same thing, but with the sequence it creates a faster tempo with short triggers. Now when we go up from sequence, the tempo gets lower. And the chords bolt creates the slowest tempo. And random, as before, randomizes the speed of the triggers. Let's see what the cloud bolt does. Previously this created a rhythm with an envelope. Let's see what it does in 4-step sequencer mode. It doesn't actually create an envelope when you're using this 4-step sequencer mode. It kind of gallops or swings the rhythm of the sequence. You can hear it really good when I connect the cloud to the second bolt at the top. The knobs and the buttons still do the same thing. Let's go over to the plum. So this is the same thing but slower. Chords causes the tempo to slow down even more, but always in this stuttered or galloped way. And random, as before, randomizes this galloped sequence. So let's head over to the moon here. Previously this created kind of a chord. Let's see what it does in this mode. And it actually creates a chord in the 4-step sequencer mode as well. You can still use the knobs as before to set the pitch of every step. Just as before, going up adds voices. And it gets more and more dissonant as the voices are added. Now I really like combining this with the stuttered or galloped mode of operation. So connecting the moon to the FM bolt while in 4-step sequencer mode, it creates a really dissonant sequence chord. And of course the random randomizes the voicing or the type of chord we're getting. And you could also combine the galloped setting with the random chord setting, so everything is randomized, the tempo and the voicings. You can still hold the sequence with the knob, but of course it keeps randomizing between the kinds of chords. Finally, for the 4-step sequencer mode, let's use the thunderstorm to connect to all the top bolts here. And as before, this really just changes the sound. So this is again a pulse wave. This is a high-pitched resonant sound. This is something root plus octave, just as sequence was. I don't know exactly what this is, but it's just another voicing again. And for example, you can use the pulse wave here and then add chords to it. And then you can still randomize and gallop them as before. And of course you can still send in CV into the inputs to create even more variation. Let me send in a slow LFO. So now only the pitch of this step is being controlled externally. But you could of course add more modulation. For example, to the third step as well. And then if you press this knob, it also randomizes the order of the steps, so this is kind of complete mayhem. So let's have a listen to mode 2, which is achieved by connecting the drone bolt to the master output. In this mode, the knobs and the buttons react like in mode 0. So they set the pitch, but you need to activate them by pressing the button. And by the way, this is a nice way to create kind of a 4-key keyboard. If you search for pitches that you want to use, so okay, let's try what the Thunderbolt will do when we connect it to the bolts at the top. Let's start off with the sequencer bolt. And as you can see, connecting the Thunderbolt to the sequencer bolt in the drone mode, this makes the module behave like it's in sequencer mode. So also the knobs and the buttons behave like in the previous mode, being the 4-step sequencer mode. Okay, let's go to the drone. So this is the same thing, but slower. Even slower. Okay, let's try the cloud. And this is the exact same thing as in the sequencer mode. Connecting the cloud to any of the top bolts creates kind of a galloped or stuttered rhythm. Maybe I should call this swing instead of gallop, but it's quite an extreme swing. Okay, let's go to the drone. So this is the same thing but slower. And I think you get it by now. Chord is the slowest, everything below it is a little bit faster, and randomizes the speed. Let's move over to the moon bolt here. Let's connect it to the sequencer bolt. So from the moment we don't have a sequence anymore, the knobs react as pitch controls again. But you need to activate activate them. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the moon creates chords in this mode, because we already kind of have a rich harmonic drone, but it creates kind of different timbres, different sounds, maybe different FM settings internally. And as usual, randomizes between the different voicings of those connections. Let's try the thunderstorm. And again, these are different timbres or different FM settings of the exact same sound. It's not really creating chords or anything. And randomizes between the settings here. Of course, you can combine this. So right now the knobs still act as pitch controls, which you need to activate. I keep saying they're pitch controls, but in this mode they're really not changing the pitch, but more the timbre. I think you get the gist. So you can still combine this with the galloped kind of 4-step sequencer mode. Now let's discover what the plum mode does when we're connecting it to the master output. This is kind of a special mode. It's the same engine as we can find in Indian Resonator, and it's kind of a digital take on the Seat Lombarde plum. Okay, so I found a nice setting. The knobs kind of switch between settings, but they are not tied to the knobs below. So let's start off by connecting the Thunderbolt to the sequence. And this doesn't act like before at all. Connecting the lightning bolt to the sequence actually just switches to a different setting. Let me try finding another setting. So as you can see, connecting these different bolts just changes the parameters. And randomizes between the different settings we get with the other 5 bolts. So for the cloud, it's kind of the same. We get different settings of the parameters of this sound. There's no sequencing, there's no real tempo or something else going on. It's not modulation, it's just changing the parameters. And the random always randomizes between these different settings. kind of does the same thing. But this increasingly goes higher and then lower again, and then a random pattern between these settings. And the thunderstorm, as you might have guessed, kind of does the same again, but again with different settings. And randomizes between these settings. So in this mode it doesn't really make that much sense to start combining different bolts. Unless you want to create more kind of randomization. Now let's discover what we can do with the chord mode of cloudbusting. First of all, you can tune the 4 voices of the chord separately using the knobs. And of course, you can also control this with control voltage. The LFO I connected to the CV input is actually a square LFO. So as you can hear, there's some kind of slew going on the CV inputs. You can't do a lot of attenuation with the knobs, but you can turn it completely down, which bottoms out the pitch of this voice. You can turn it completely up, which maxes out the pitch of this voice. Let me remove this. A much more interesting thing you can do with the chord mode is done by using the buttons. Let me turn down all the other voices except this one, so we're only listening to the first one. And what happens when you press these buttons is that you start inserting spaces between the notes. Let me show you. There's some kind of envelope going on, and the longer you press the button, the further these gates or envelopes are apart. And this can be done separately for every voice. So as you can hear now, this note is continuous, but when you start pressing this button, and by being able to separately control this for every voice, you can create interesting stuttered rhythms or even arpeggios, sequences. Now there's no way to get back to the droning sound besides just disconnecting the chord mode from the master output. So let me introduce some gating again. And then what we can do with the other connections actually stacks on top of this kind of sequence. We start off with the thunderbolt. As you can see, there's some kind of extra gating or triggering going on, which, as we saw before, slows down when we go up. I actually think that the pattern we created here just slows down. Over there it's relatively fast again. This one is slower again. And the random bolt again introduces some kind of random tempo or rhythm to the chords or the sequence of chords we created. Let's go over to the cloud. So this really just adds an extra gate on top of the sequence we created here. It's really interesting how we can change the sequence of stacked or staggered notes by connecting the different modulators. Now, just as before, connecting the moon. Creates different kind of voicings. Connecting the moon to the sequencer bolt actually gives us kind of a chorus or a unison, perhaps ensemble sound. The drone bolt does kind of the same, but one octave higher. Plum changes the sound into a more resonant, high-pitched chord. This becomes even more resonant or high-pitched, perhaps even a little bit lo-fi or chiptune kind of sound. Connecting the FM bolt introduces some kind of extra harmonics. And as usual, connecting the random steps between the different options we had before. Now let's connect this one. So this changes the sound in another way. This is again kind of a square wave. Plum gives us some of that resonant, almost Indian resonator Seattle Lombarded plum sound. Connecting the FM, the thunderstorm gives us kind of a high-passed sound. And random steps through them randomly. Now let me quickly reset the pattern we made. Let's change up the chord. This is nice. Let me quickly go over what happens when we start connecting different modulators this way. this creates kind of a sequence which starts slowing down. Now if you start running things like this through a reverb or delay, or perhaps both, you really get an interesting wash of sounds. Let me add some reverb and delay to this in post-production. You should be hearing it now. Now I think this is really beautiful. Enough of this. Okay. So again, when we introduced a sequence, or when we want to go back to the unsequenced sound, we need to disconnect the mode. So this is the unison or chorus sound. This is the same but higher. This is kind of resonant. This is high-pitched or resonant 2. And then finally the thunderstorm. To the square wave. Plum will be the resonant, plum-like sound. Okay, that's it for this mode. So next up is the FM wavetable synth. As you might remember, the first control knob kind of scans a bank of waves. This one is kind of a volume control. It doesn't go completely to zero or to silence. This one I think is the FM index, and this one controls the pitch of the modulator. I'll quickly go over this as well. The lightning bolt gives us some different settings of the parameters. And randomizes between these settings. The cloud does exactly the same, but with different settings. And random, again, randomizes between these settings. The moon bolt really doesn't do anything in my experience. As you can see and hear. Nope. And the thunderstorm switches between different settings of the parameters again. Just like the lightning bolt and the cloud did. And random switches between these settings. I actually think that the thunderstorm switches between different waves from the bank of waves here, and that the other two influence the settings of either the index or the pitch of the modulator. So let me try patching in a control voltage. This is a sine wave coming from generate. Let me turn up the rate. If we then connect the thunderstorm to the randomizer, it gets quite interesting really fast. Let's add another LFO. This time to the FM index. Or let's try going into the volume. Turning up the rate of the LFO. Kind of works as a tremolo. Let me try adding one more LFO. This time it's coming from orbit 3. By the way, the buttons in this mode switch between different settings as well. So now for the last mode, which is the random mode, and this is the most random of the randomest. Connecting this to the master randomizes the output between all the different modes cloud busting has to offer. And the function of the knobs and the buttons is actually mode dependent. connecting any of the lower bolts to any of the upper bolts only kind of changes the speed in which the random function switches between different sounds. And of course, as usual with tempo-based patches, connecting the random to the thunderbolt or lightning bolt, and as we'll see, the cloud randomizes the speed. So in this mode it randomizes the speed at which a random mode is selected. That's a lot of random there. Let's briefly try this. So these connections really only affect the speed in some way. And the same goes for the moon. And also for the thunderstorm. Now we can go on and combine some things, but in this mode this only adds more randomization. So let me add some delay and reverb to this. And as this was the last mode of cloud busting I needed to show you, I'll finish off this overview here. As you probably noticed, I've used some overlays for the different modes. These are part of a user guide I made to be able to make sense of the different connections cloud busting has to offer. If it's already finished and available for download, when I release this video, I'll post a link to the download in the description. If it's not yet available, I'll add some information in the description about that as well. I hope you enjoyed watching this video about cloud busting. I tried a very methodical approach, as there's loads of sound examples on the internet about cloud busting already. Thanks for watching. Bye.